The Deadbug and its variations are core stability exercises, and the objective is to keep what's called your central column steady throughout any variation of the movement. So everything between your shoulders and your hips should be staying as still as possible. When you tap a heel to the floor, it's effectively providing a stimulus for the musculature that pulls your rib cage towards the front of your pelvis to do the stabilizing work, whilst the musculature that lifts your leg, like your hip flexors and your rectus femoris, it allows those to move whilst these front abdominal muscles are staying steady. And this ties into the ability to do squats, to be able to run, to be able to do any kind of lunge variation. And so it's a very good starting point, anything that requires you to have a somewhat stable central column. And when you're doing the reaching overhead version, it's kind of a similar principle. When you reach overhead like this, all of the little muscles that are between your rib cage are encouraged to effectively open up just a tiny bit. That is one of the things that provides your brain with a bit of feedback as to how far your arm is going behind your head. By doing this exercise, what you're effectively doing is you're keeping the muscles active between your lowest rib and your pelvis as your arm reaches overhead, because a lot of people, when they reach their arm overhead, they don't have enough range of motion in this musculature at the front here to allow that to open under control. And as a result, a common fault can be the thoracic lumbar junction, so the bottom of your thoracic spine and the top of your lumbar spine. A malfunction can be that you will have thoracic lumbar extension instead of shoulder flexion. And so by doing this exercise, you're effectively encouraging proper shoulder flexion by keeping this tucked and flat and your lower back flat on the floor. And as a result of that, it is again some kind of core stabilizing exercise, because if you're doing any kind of overhead movement, you don't want most of your overhead range of motion to be coming from spinal extension. And so when you combine this exercise, which is what most commonly people call a dead bug, you're doing both of these things at the same time, and so it can be a little bit more complex to do. Progression of this exercise is just reaching further, so your heel taps to the ground with a straight leg and your hand taps to the ground with a straight arm at the same time. And then when you're at this long position here, you've effectively demonstrated that you can keep everything between your lowest rib and the top of your hip contracted to stabilize your spine, whilst allowing your hip flexors and the top of your quads to be loose and control themselves, and whilst demonstrating that you have the prerequisite range of motion in your shoulders to be able to allow full overhead range of motion. So if you can be very competent at this and you can progress to being able to do it effortlessly with full range of motion, then you have demonstrated the prerequisite skills to be able to do movements like overhead press, overhead squats, any kind of combination based movement, an overhead walking lunge, for example, things like that. If you can demonstrate this perfectly, then you are definitely well on your way to being able to do those things.